The sun was barely rising when Chef Mark noticed something that didn't sit right with him. He was running his morning errands in the small town of Pinebrook, a quiet community known for its well-kept homes and friendly faces. But there, standing outside the entrance of the Maple Grove care home, was something far darker than he'd ever expected to find. As a chef, Mark's life was usually centered around fresh ingredients, new recipes, and the hustle of busy kitchens. But this was a different kind of challenge, one that would call on his instincts, his sense of justice, and his commitment to the people he cared about. For weeks, Mark had been volunteering at Maple Grove, helping to prepare meals for the elderly residents. It had become something of a routine for him, delivering meals, chatting with the residents, listening to their stories of yesteryears. He wasn't there to be their savior. He was there to brighten their days, a small act of kindness in a place where many felt forgotten. But that morning, as he watched an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson leave the building, something caught his eye. He didn't know it then, but that moment would change everything. Mrs. Thompson had always been a quiet woman, soft-spoken and sweet. She loved to talk about her late husband, a man she'd adored for over 50 years. She had always been warm toward Mark, flashing him a smile whenever she passed by his kitchen. But today, as she walked slowly down the hallway of the care home, there was an unfamiliar tension in her posture. Her shoulders were hunched, her steps slower than usual, and her face, usually bright and peaceful, was tight, as though she was holding something back. As Mark watched from the kitchen window, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He'd always been intuitive around people, especially those in need of care and comfort. And this was a gut feeling he couldn't ignore. There was someone else in the picture, someone who was supposed to be helping the residents, but seemed to be making things worse. Nurse Rachel had always been the one people turned to when they needed help. Tall, sharp, and seemingly efficient, she had a way of making herself the center of attention, always in control. But there was something off about her demeanor today, something that didn't match the caring attitude a nurse should have. Mark had seen Rachel around the care home, giving her orders, speaking in a tone that made some of the residents flinch. He'd brushed it off at first, assuming she was just a strict professional, someone who demanded high standards. But today, as he saw her walking behind Mrs. Thompson, Mark noticed something chilling. He couldn't hear their conversation from where he stood, but the way Rachel was standing so close to Mrs. Thompson, her hand roughly gripping the elderly woman's arm, spoke volumes. The fear in Mrs. Thompson's eyes wasn't hard to spot. Something wasn't right. And Mark's concern grew with every passing moment. He couldn't ignore what he was seeing, what he felt, even if he didn't have all the details. But there was one thing that could give him the truth: the hidden camera he had installed the week before. The device had been placed in a common room, just above the doorframe. Mark had suspected that not everything was as it seemed at Maple Grove. The residents were often treated like children, their voices ignored, and their needs sidelined. Mark had grown suspicious of the way some staff members interacted with the elderly, especially when no one was looking. He had no idea how serious it would get, though. No idea that today he would capture something far more alarming than he'd ever imagined. With a knot in his stomach, Mark rushed to the back office to check the footage. His hands trembled as he clicked play, the grainy video loading on the screen. There was Rachel, just as he had seen her earlier, walking with Mrs. Thompson. Mark leaned closer, his eyes scanning the footage for every detail. The video began to play, and what unfolded in front of him was nothing short of shocking. As the camera showed Rachel's approach, it became evident that this wasn't a simple interaction. Mrs. Thompson seemed to try to keep her distance, but Rachel's aggressive, behavior continued to escalate. She was speaking harshly, her words too quiet to hear clearly. But Mark could see the way Mrs. Thompson flinched at every sharp gesture Rachel made. It was obvious that Mrs. Thompson wasn't in control of the situation. And worse, it was clear. She was frightened. Mark's heart raced. The woman who had always been a bright light in the home was now being broken down by someone who was supposed to protect her. The footage didn't stop there. As Rachel pushed the elderly woman toward the exit, Mrs. Thompson's hands were trembling. The nurse's grip tightened, dragging her in a way that no caregiver should. And just as Mark began to question what he should do next, something even more disturbing happened. Rachel turned around to make sure no one was watching, then spat out a few words that left no doubt in Mark's mind. Rachel knew what she was doing, and she didn't care who saw it. The camera had caught it all. But what Mark didn't know yet was just how deep the problem ran at Maple Grove. With his heart pounding, Mark stood frozen in that office, staring at the screen. He was torn between wanting to confront Rachel right then and there or to go to the authorities. His mind raced as he thought of the best way to protect Mrs. Thompson and all the others who might be suffering in silence. But the question that haunted him wasn't just whether Rachel's behavior would be exposed. It was whether anyone would believe him once he spoke up. Before Mark could make up his mind, the video cut to a new scene. Another elderly resident was now in Rachel's care, and this time, the aggression was even more intense. Mark knew that if he didn't act soon, more lives would be affected by Rachel's cruelty. But how could he expose the truth without putting his job at risk? How could he ensure that the residents would be safe from a nurse who was supposed to be their protector, but was anything but? And just as Mark sat back, deep in thought, the screen blinked again, showing Rachel walking down the hall with a devilish grin that sent shivers down his spine. Was she aware of the camera? Was there more to her than he could have possibly imagined? Mark didn't have the answers yet, but what he knew for sure was this: the truth was far darker than he had ever anticipated. And now he had to decide what to do with the evidence that could bring it all to light. What would happen next? Would Mark expose the truth? Or would Nurse Rachel get away with her dark secret? Stay tuned, because the story is only beginning to unfold. Mark spent the next few hours pacing back and forth in the small office, the footage still playing in his mind, looping over and over like a bad dream he couldn't escape. He knew he had to act, but everything felt so overwhelming. He wasn't a detective or a whistleblower. He was just a chef who had stumbled onto something he wasn't prepared for. The question kept echoing in his head. Could he really expose a nurse who had been trusted to care for the most vulnerable people in the community? Maple Grove Care Home had always been a place where families could feel secure, knowing their loved ones were being looked after. It was well-funded, well-regarded, and had a reputation for providing a comfortable environment for the elderly. That's what had drawn Mark to volunteer there in the first place. He had seen the staff in action, heard residents speak highly of the home, and believed in its mission. But over time, small inconsistencies started to emerge. Complaints about the food came in every now and then. A few residents had mentioned a nurse who seemed less than friendly, but no one had ever come forward with anything concrete. As Mark worked in the kitchen, he'd witnessed things that didn't sit right. Nurses snapping at residents, leaving them to wait for long periods for basic care, or ignoring their needs. It was clear there were cracks in the system, but the problem had always felt abstract, like whispers in the wind. Now, however, it wasn't just a whisper. It was a full-blown revelation, and it was staring him right in the face. The more Mark thought about it, the more he realized how long Nurse Rachel had been able to get away with her behavior. The other staff members barely seemed to notice. Or maybe they didn't care enough to look. The elderly residents, for the most part, couldn't speak out for themselves. Some were too frail, others too confused, or simply too afraid to say anything. They trusted the people around them, especially the ones who were supposed to be their caregivers, their protectors. They couldn't fathom that someone in that position could be capable of cruelty. Mark thought of Mrs. Thompson again, the way her face had looked when Rachel had dragged her down the hall, the way her hands had trembled, as if she was holding back tears. Mrs. Thompson wasn't the only one suffering, Mark realized. There were other residents, people who had been neglected, bullied, or worse, for months or maybe even years. He thought of Mr. Pierce, who always asked for a second helping of the meals he loved, but rarely got it, and Mrs. Harris, who had a beautiful collection of scarves, but no longer had the energy to wear them. He had always thought they were just a little too quiet, a little too withdrawn. But now, with everything he had seen, he wondered if their silence had been out of fear. The stakes were higher than Mark had imagined, and it was becoming clear that exposing Rachel's behavior wasn't just about one woman being a bully. It was about a much larger issue. If Nurse Rachel had been getting away with this for so long, how many others like her were in the system? How many times had these kinds of things been ignored or brushed under the rug by the people in charge? It wasn't just Rachel who needed to be exposed. It was the whole system of care that had allowed her to thrive. Mark didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was undeniable. He had seen how she had manipulated her position. She was smart, calculating, and she had always known when and where to act out her cruelty. She had a way of getting close to the residents, appearing caring, only to tear them down once they were isolated from the rest of the world. And the more Mark thought about it, the more he realized that Rachel wasn't just a rogue nurse. She was a symptom of a much bigger problem that no one was talking about. The authorities would need more than just video footage to take action. Mark knew that. He'd have to gather everything, every scrap of evidence he could find. If he went to the police with only one or two instances, they might dismiss it. They'd want a history, witnesses, a full pattern. But how could he even begin to gather that when everyone around him seemed too scared or too compliant to speak out? Mark thought about the other staff members. He had to be careful who he trusted. The nurses and aides who worked alongside Rachel might have seen what was happening, but they might also be too afraid to get involved. Mark had heard whispers in the hallways, rumors about Rachel's temper, her dominance over the other staff. She was the kind of person who made people fall into line, whether through manipulation or sheer force. It was easy for someone like Rachel to hide behind the guise of authority and intimidate anyone who dared to question her. But Mark couldn't back down now. He thought of the residents again. People like Mrs. Thompson, who had already lived through so much, only to be subjected to this. They deserved better. And if no one else would stand up, then it had to be him. There was also the question of his own safety. If he exposed Rachel and her behavior, there was a very real chance she'd retaliate. She was powerful in that small world, and Mark wasn't naive enough to think she would just accept being exposed. He had seen the way she reacted when she thought no one was watching. Sharp words, controlling gestures, and that cold smile that sent a chill down his spine. What if she found out he was behind it all? Would she go after him? Would she try to silence him before he could reach anyone who could help? As Mark's mind raced, he realized that this wasn't just about saving the residents. This was about uncovering a system of abuse that had been allowed to continue for far too long. It was about showing the world that the elderly weren't invisible, that their voices mattered, and that people like Rachel couldn't get away with hurting them. Mark knew he had to act quickly, but he didn't have all the answers. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. But there was still so much more to uncover. Would the truth come to light in time? Would Mark be able to protect the residents while taking down a nurse who had made her cruelty her power? And would anyone believe him? Or would he just become another voice drowned out by the noise of the world around him? He didn't have time to think anymore. The clock was ticking, and every second felt like an eternity. The battle for the truth had only just begun, and Mark was about to find out just how far Nurse Rachel was willing to go to protect her secrets. Mark knew there was no turning back now. The evidence was clear, but what he didn't expect was how quickly things would escalate. He had thought about going to the police, about talking to the higher-ups at Maple Grove, but something inside him told him that if he didn't act fast, the truth would be buried forever. Rachel had a hold on the place, and that grip was tightening with every passing hour. If he didn't get help soon, she would continue to manipulate and control the residents. No one would ever know what had really been happening. It wasn't long before Mark realized he wasn't the only one watching. A few days after reviewing the footage, he overheard a conversation in the hallway that confirmed his worst fears. One of the aides had been talking about how close Rachel had gotten to being discovered, and the way her eyes darted nervously when she spoke made it clear that the walls were closing in on her. Mark wasn't sure if the aide was talking to someone else in the staff or if they were just venting, but the fear in their voice was unmistakable. Rachel knew someone was onto her, and she was starting to feel the heat. That night, Mark made up his mind. He had to expose her, but he also needed protection. He reached out to a local journalist, someone he knew from a few of the food charity events he'd participated in over the years. Her name was Sarah, and she had always been a compassionate and trustworthy person. Mark trusted her to take the story seriously and knew she could help him make sure the truth reached the right people. Sarah was shocked when Mark told her the whole story, and she immediately agreed to help. They made a plan to take everything to the press, to show the footage, and to speak to the families of the residents. Sarah promised Mark she'd keep him safe, but the reality of what they were about to do didn't fully sink in until the moment. They walked into the newsroom, ready to bring down the woman who had made so many people's lives a living hell. The news spread quickly, like wildfire. As soon as Sarah published the story, local news outlets picked it up, and soon enough, people from all over town were talking about it. The footage was shocking, revealing Rachel's callous and manipulative behavior toward the elderly residents, especially Mrs. Thompson, who had been too afraid to speak out herself. The public was outraged, and questions about Maple Grove's oversight and policies began to flood in. But it wasn't just the town that was talking. The families of the residents began showing up at Maple Grove, demanding answers. The tension inside the care home was palpable. Rachel's once dominant presence was now under scrutiny, and people who had once been too afraid to speak up were now finding their voices. Former employees came forward, sharing stories of the things they'd witnessed, but been too intimidated to report. Mark had been right all along. Rachel wasn't an isolated case. The system had been complicit in turning a blind eye to the abuse happening under its roof. Then came the twist Mark hadn't anticipated. Rachel didn't fight back in the way he thought she would. No, instead she fell silent, completely silent. Her arrogance had disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating demeanor. She was let go immediately, but Mark could tell that even in her resignation, there was something ominous about her calmness. She hadn't been caught off guard. She had known this day was coming. It wasn't just the employees who feared her. It was everyone in the building. And now, Mark was learning just how deeply her influence had run. What happened next shocked everyone. An investigation into Maple Grove revealed that Rachel had been the tip of the iceberg. Over the years, multiple complaints had been filed against her, but they had never been taken seriously. Worse still, it turned out there were other staff members involved in the systemic neglect and mistreatment of residents, and the facility itself had cut corners to save money on proper staffing and care. The investigation revealed more than just a few isolated cases. It showed a broader pattern of mismanagement and abuse that had plagued the home for years. Mark had no idea how deep the rot went, but as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Rachel was just a product of a broken system. In the end, Maple Grove Care Home was forced to shut down temporarily for a complete overhaul. It was a wake-up call for the community. It wasn't just about a single nurse. It was about the importance of keeping those who were vulnerable safe and heard. The residents, like Mrs. Thompson, deserved better, and Mark's actions had made sure they got it. Mark found himself exhausted, but relieved. The weight of the situation was still heavy on his heart, but he knew he had done the right thing. He had faced a powerful system, and against all odds, he had brought it down. The residents of Maple Grove were finally free from the cruelty they'd endured for so long, and the families could begin to heal. As for Mark, he never imagined his days in the kitchen would lead him down this path, but the experience had changed him. He had learned that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can lead to the greatest changes. His work wasn't done, but he now knew that standing up for what's right could make a difference. No matter how daunting the challenge, the story was over for now. But for Mark and the residents of Maple Grove, it was only the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter of healing, justice, and hope. And as the story spread, people everywhere began to reflect on the lessons Mark's actions had taught them. The truth, no matter how dark, would always come to light, and when it did, it was up to all of us to make sure it never happened again. Jadi no Mini.